SPECs are powerful cards originally printed in the Black and White Boundaries Crossed expansion. These cards were only item and tool cards, which were considered the same at the time, but whatever. They were brought back in the 7th Scarlet and Violet expansion, Temporal Forces, and we've been seeing more and more ever since, now including Stadium and Energy cards as well. If you ever look at the full list of these, you'll notice that they seem to wildly vary in power, with some seeming like an obvious inclusion in most decks, and others, you know, that aren't. They very obviously aren't. Case in point, our good friend Pokevital A, which should seriously be considered like some type of crime against humanity because of just how bad it is. It reads, heal 150 damage from one of your Pokemon, which sounds strong for an item card if you stop reading there. Unfortunately, the text continues, this card can't be put into your hand or deck from the discard pile. This thing is terrible. But what's really baffling is that its fun little second effect is unique to it and its brother from the same set, Neutralization Zone, which is embarrassed to be associated with it. The intention from the game designers seems obvious, you know, wanting to avoid certain cases where these cards are looped over and over and bring the pace of play to a crawl. I don't think there's really a good way to recycle these cards right now. If you know a way to do this and still actually attack and play the game, please let me know, because I don't know if there's a thing that you can do. Bizarrely, the SPECs that are considered wildly more powerful than these just don't have this limitation of being, you know, never coming back from the discard, and can consistently be used at least twice. But I'm assuming that they were left alone as they can't really stall out the game or something. Whatever, the card sucks, right? Who cares? Well, the weird thing about this card is that it's obviously trying to avoid using a mechanic that the game already has, and that's meant to limit powerful cards so that they're only able to be used once. The Lost Zone, introduced in the Platinum expansion, is defined by the rulebook as a unique zone that's considered out of play. Cards can be sent to the Lost Zone in many ways, such as through the effects of attacks, abilities, or trainer cards. Unlike the discard pile, any cards sent to the Lost Zone cannot be recovered and are no longer playable during that game. In simple terms, it's a forever discard, and nothing can come back from it. And there's some cards that interact with the Lost Zone that want to send your opponent's cards away, while some want to send your own cards away, and this enables like a variety of different strategies, with some being control options, some being offensive options, and everything in between. This mechanic of a super turbo discard pile isn't unique to the Pokemon trading card game, with Magic the Gathering having an exile zone and Yu-Gi-Oh! Having cards that can banish other cards. The major difference being that Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh! Always have this mechanic in the game, while Pokemon usually doesn't. From 2009's Platinum expansion to 2011's Call of Legends, we saw a slow but steady trickle of cards that interacted with the Lost Zone. We did not see any cards that mentioned the Lost Zone after this until 2018, with Sun and Moon Lost Thunder, with more cards being released until Cosmic Eclipse in 2019. Finally, the latest return of the Lost Zone was in 2022 with Sword and Shield Lost Origin. Then they skipped a set, and then we got a few more in the Crown Zenith, the last expansion for Sword and Shield, which are still in the game today. In the Pokemon trading card game, cards have a printed block with an expiration date. If you've ever heard someone talk about rotation, they are talking about the point in time at which a block of cards is rotated out of the game, to offset the new cards being added into it. Once rotated out, these cards become illegal to use in the standard format. So, knowing all of this, the Lost Zone's sporadic release schedule shouldn't seem all that weird, because there's plenty of mechanics that are only supported for a few expansions and then allowed to gracefully rotate out. And some of these come back, you know, sometimes, or at least in spirit, with the Lost Zone being an exception to the rule in how often it has actually come back. However, the Lost Zone in particular actually has one anomaly in the way that it functions that makes it different from these other gimmicks, and which makes the way it's treated kind of strange. So most gimmick cards come with an associated rule box which explains how they work and make it so that a player that is completely unfamiliar with their mechanics can still play a game with these cards after simply reading the text on the card, without needing to consult an external source or a rule book. However, you would be hard-pressed to actually find a card that explains what the Lost Zone is. This is because there are no cards that are the Lost Zone in the same way that we have cards that are Terra Pokemon or Mega Evolutions or, you know, stuff like that. What this means is that the Lost Zone is technically always in play, being an additional mechanic that's been codified into the game, regardless of if there are any cards that actually interact with it. So why then do we have this like awkward jury-rigged solution to make cards single use, when the obvious solution seems to simply be to put these cards in the Lost Zone once they've been used? The TCG does not look back often, and the expanded format is where most of these cards can get a second go at life. But a lot of these rotated mechanics will likely stay lost to time. Some cards are currently or will be trapped in mechanic jail, and are unlikely to be seen until their mechanics are brought back wholesale, even if it seems obvious to do so mechanically or thematically. Because of this, it's simply not possible to incorporate the Lost Zone into modern cards because it is currently not in season. Even if the changes to the meta that it would make wouldn't be that impactful, it still can't be added in. And this mentality makes a lot of cards very strange to look at, with cards obviously intended to do certain things, just not doing so. Even beyond the Lost Zone. For example, Aegislash from Paradox Rift is immune to EXs and Vs, one of which will rotate soon and leaves us with a card that is immune to Pokemon that it can't encounter. While the intention is obviously for this Aegislash to be immune to multi-price cards, because of a reluctance to future-proof these, Aegislash isn't immune to EX with a capital EX and GX cards, despite their very similar role to Vs and lowercase EXs. How do you pronounce these differently? What is that? What? The Pokemon trading card game has created a problem for itself, and it can't use the obvious solution because it is part of the problem. So it would be a lot of effort to future-proof years of mechanics, and the game would become extremely bloated if we kept every new gimmick the video games introduced. But I believe that the Lost Zone specifically would not be a particularly intrusive mechanic to keep, which should be obvious by how often it's brought back. Although Pokemon is, in general terms, a much more straightforward game than its contemporaries, the Lost Zone isn't a super complicated concept within the game. I know, some of us are still cowering in fear from Cramorant and Sableye, but cards and archetypes that are too powerful when put together can simply be allowed to rotate out like every other archetype, which could leave us with less egregious, more moderate cards that won't completely dominate the format, while still keeping the extra layer of complexity. Unfortunately, bringing back the Lost Zone as a speed check for certain powerful cards just doesn't seem like something that could ever really be done. Wait a minute. Earlier, I mentioned that Sun and Moon didn't have any cards that mentioned the Lost Zone until Lost Thunder. I lied. Prism Star cards were a special type of card introduced in Sun and Moon Ultra Prism, which is 4 expansions before Lost Thunder. These cards were limited to only 1 copy of each in your deck and were so powerful that they would go into the Lost Zone instead of the discard when discarded. Does this sound familiar at all? Does this sound like anything? A difference between these cards and Ace-Specs is that Prism Star cards could be Pokemon, supporters, stadiums, or energy cards. I believe that they're still pretty similar. The concept is still there because at the time there were no cards that interacted with the Lost Zone, with one exception, outside of these cards that would be unrecoverable once used. Sure, eventually cards that interacted with the Lost Zone were introduced, but this was 4 expansions and 9 months without any cards besides Prism Stars that interacted with the Lost Zone, and the game was fine. Mostly, I think. I think this is pretty good proof that the Lost Zone can stick around and not ruin everything when doing so, but I also think it's perfectly reasonable to not want too many cooks in the kitchen. I don't know if there's any other mechanics that would have made good permanent additions to the game, so, if anybody can think of any, please let me know. Lost Zone, I've always been caught up on these weird solutions, and, despite everything that I've mentioned here, there's still like one unanswered question that I just could not figure out. Why did they make Pokevital A so bad? Cards can be sent to the Lost Zone in many ways, such as through the effects of abilities, attacks, or trainer cards. That's not what it says. It just wouldn't be that impactful. Oh wait. Oops. And are unlikely to be seen until their mechanics are brought back wholesale. Even if it means Ugh.